Okay? So they had it. All right, so now they're looking at it going, all right, so I'm getting messages here, but I have no idea what they're saying. So they put a top group of mathematicians and scientists. The British did. Alan Turing was the key guy, and he came up with a machine. It's one of the prototypes of computers. He came up with a machine that was able to go through all the various different permutations and try and figure out what the heck the Germans were saying in today's bulk of messages. Because the Germans are using it all over the place. Of course, the Germans are feeling very confident because they're like, they can't crack it, they can't crack it, they can't crack it. We have no indication that they've cracked it. But eventually, they will crack it. Alan Turing and his team figured out that there was one thing that was in every single German message. All the other messages and component parts and so forth were different. But they always ended their message with Heil Hitler. And if you got Heil Hitler, if you know that that's going to be in each message, then you know H-E-I-L-H-I-T-L-E-R, whatever, and you can start to maneuver and wrinkle and so forth and get some of the other components. Have you ever done deciphering and so forth? I mean, some of them are harder than others, but we cracked it. Write that down. We cracked it. Thank you very much, Alan Turing, and thank you, Benedict Cumberbatch, for doing an excellent portrayal of Alan Turing's story in a film called The Imitation Game with Keira Knightley. But make sure you understand this, because the implications are huge. When the Allies cracked it, we knew more about what the Germans were up to. But we didn't want the Germans to know that we'd cracked it. Because if the Germans knew that we cracked their code, they'll make a new one. They won't use that code system anymore. We want them to continue using that code system so that we continue getting the intelligence. But then you're sort of scratching your head going, well, when are we going to use that intelligence that we've gotten to our advantage? Because we would get some intelligence. There was a time, write it down, Winston Churchill got intelligence that the Germans were going to bomb a city that they'd never bombed before. The people in Coventry, it was like this medieval city. It had no factories. It was this old British, English city out in the countryside, and the Germans were going to bomb it, you know, because they wanted to break the British will. The folks in Coventry were just like oblivious to it. Churchill knew. He could have ordered an evacuation. And then the Germans would have bombed a city and there'd be a bunch of broken buildings, but the population would have been okay. But Churchill knew that there was enough intelligence operation that the Germans had within the British countryside that the word would get back to Germany that Coventry had been evacuated on the eve of a surprise air attack. And then the Germans would have known that the code had been cracked. How'd you like to be prime minister in charge of that information? What did Churchill do? Did he save the lives of the people in Coventry, or did he save the secret that they'd broken the German code? How many of you guys would have saved the lives of the people in Coventry? How many of you guys would have saved the integrity of the secret and used it for another day? And that wasn't the only one. I mean, it actually comes out in the film, and I think this is fairly accurate. We found out various different maneuvers of, like, submarines, German submarines. And if you were on the team and you're like, oh, I know that I've got a cousin's kid who is going to be on an orphan ship that is going to be going through the waters of North Atlantic. And now we've cracked the code that there's a German wolf pack, a group of U-boats up there. Churchill hung on to that information and used it to his best advantage. Here's what they used it for. Write this down. They used it, ultimately, to help prepare for D-Day. That was going to be the big, huge, massive amphibious assault. That was a make-or-break Allied effort. June 6, 1944. We were trying to fool the Germans this way, that way, into thinking that we're going to attack in another place. I mentioned that before. And we were doing all kinds. We had a fake army that was developed around one of our great U.S. generals, General Patton, who the Germans couldn't believe that he might have been sort of demoted because there was a guy in a medical tent that was suffering from PTSD, shell shock. Remember, I think I might have told you that. And Patton was like very, very old school. He's like, you coward. And took his gloves and went boom, boom, boom. And thankfully, the United States military at that point understood that PTSD was a real thing. And Patton was in trouble. He almost got fired. But he didn't. He got reassigned. He was in charge of a fake army. in Britain. And they literally made all these fake inflatable tanks, and they created all this fake communication and air chatter and so forth. And Patton was supposed to be in charge of the real invasion against the area north of Normandy. We fooled Hitler. How did we know that we had fooled Hitler? Because of the code. We were listening in on what they were saying to each other, and when we landed at Normandy, they were saying to each other, this isn't the real invasion. Keep your Panzer tank divisions in reserve for the real attack, which is coming to the north. So did they send their tank divisions in on the beaches where the U.S. soldiers and the Canadians and the British were like on the beaches? No, they didn't. They just had their regular forces on the beaches. And then we were able to get the beaches, and we were able to put lots and lots of our own tanks and heavy equipment and break through. That was the payoff. Very, very difficult decision to make, but Churchill did that. You got to make tough decisions. Mike, every single president, starting with Harry S. Truman all the way to the current president, has at their disposal the ability to call in a nuclear strike in the event of a war situation. Oh. It's big. Let me play for you. Yeah, let me play for you this clip right here. How many of you guys have ever seen The Imitation Game? One of the things that was interesting about Alan Turing as a person, he was brilliant, he was able to put it all together. He did have an interesting characteristic that was not cool in British society at that time. In fact, it was against the law. He was gay, yeah, he was gay. And that ultimately hurt his legal status later on because he was thrown in prison later on after having a gay connection with somebody. And hello?
Hi, Mr. Hampton. Can I have Maya come to the office?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, because one of the things is like, as far as spies and so forth, I mean, who do they want in like their really high security technology kind of positions? People who were married, people who were following the law so that they wouldn't be prone to blackmail or infiltration by so-called honeypot spies from the other side. It's a favorite tactic. The Russians do it a lot during the Cold War. They go after United States or British personnel with like women who like become friends with them, really intimate friends, in order to get like information and so forth from them. Okay, so let's take a look at the preview for
this war. We're not winning it. If you speak a word of what I'm about to show you, you will be executed for high treason. It's beautiful. It's the greatest encryption device in history, and the Germans use it for all communication. Everyone thinks Enigma is unbreakable. Let me try, you will know for sure. Mr. Turing, do you know how many died because of it? I don't. 3. While we've been having this conversation. Gentlemen, meet Mr. Turing. We've to work together then. I'm afraid these men would only slow me down. Hope they're at school doing.
We're short on staff.
We get more staff in.
You have 6 minutes to complete the task.
Is Enigma possible? No, it takes me 8. 5 minutes and 34 seconds.
You said to do it in under 6. What is it that we're really doing?
We're going to break an unbreakable Nazi code and win the war.
oh, I love that. Oh.
To pull off this irascible genius routine, one actually has to be a genius. I'm designing a machine that will allow us to break every message, every day, instantly.
You're going to need all the help you can get, and they are not going to help you if they do not like you.
Have you decrypted a single German message? You will never understand the importance of what I am creating here. Our patience has expired. No!
If you fire Helen, well then you'll have to fire me.
Me too. And me.
Better bloody work.
Adam, you do not have to do this alone.
What are you doing? What's going on?
The Navy thinks that one of us is a Soviet spy.
You've got more secrets than the best of them. What if I don't fancy her in that way?
Don't tell anyone, Helen. It's illegal.
I'm just a mathematician.
Sometimes it is the people who no one imagines anything of who do the things that no one can imagine.
Yeah, pretty intense. There's a lot of, one of the things about World War II, oh yeah, thanks. We're not, sorry, we're not going to talk about, yeah. One of the things that really matters, yes, hello?
Hi, can I have the custody office?
Yes.
Thank you.
One of the things that really matters, of course, is like all the various different, there's a lot of really good movies, and if, yeah, we'll show you some clips, because World War II is just packed with all kinds of drama, and it does help actually watching movies and so forth to get a better understanding. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's kind of like you pick up a cell phone. It's got the same kind of computing capability of like, the Apollo program, probably greater. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, this is very, very primitive, and yet it made a big difference. Put this down. The Germans continued using German U-boats. A little bit better technology, but pretty basically the similar type of thing. And you can understand why they did that. They didn't have the ability to build up a big, huge, massive fleet of destroyers and battleships and so forth, but they did, and Hitler was doing this illegally. He was building up a U-boat fleet in violation of the Versailles Treaty. And he put it into work in the Atlantic because same as World War I. Why sink a bunch of ships in the Atlantic Ocean? Because you can, and pretty much all those ships that are heading toward Europe are heading toward Britain. Okay? I mean, initially France, but once France is knocked out, Britain. So the German U-boats are sinking them. It's a little bit different this time, though. There's going to be some innovations on the defense to make it harder for the German U-boats to be successful. One thing that's going to help is the improvement, continued operation of destroyers. Write that down. They're not as big as battleships, but they're going to be primarily used, naval vessels are going to be primarily used to accompany convoys heading from, typically, Canada, although we'll see, across the Atlantic Ocean, South American, Central American countries are going to be shipping things over to Britain, selling them goods. Why won't they sell to the Germans? This is a repeat from World War I. The British Navy, the British blockade. They have an effective blockade against imports coming into Germany. Again. Now, granted, before the British could block off and keep all of the traffic coming through into the North Sea. Now that the Germans have port facilities in France and Italy and so forth, you could get some things into different destination points that the Germans controlled. Nevertheless, there's not going to be a lot of goods coming over the Atlantic to help the Germans out. So therefore, the Germans try to sink them, and the Allies try to protect them. What else do the Allies have? We actually talked about this already. The Allies will have developed sonar technology. Echolocation in the water. What you'll have on a destroyer typically is they'll be going through the water as they're accompanying a whole bunch of merchant ships. You got tons of these merchant ships, and you got some destroyers, and they'll be doing ping, ping. You'll have a little operator there looking at the screen and so forth. And if they detect a German sub, they scramble. Of course, the Germans, they quickly become aware of this. They obviously don't want to be sighted from the air. And by the way, write this down. From the air, they could be sighted more easily at a distance by aircraft. There will be aircraft flying between Iceland and the United Kingdom, between Iceland and a base in Greenland, between Greenland and Newfoundland in Canada. So they're going to try and get all eyes. Yes? Sure. And if Cadence wants to get word of the next person coming, that'll be fine. Thank you. Okay. What are you guys getting like? Whatever. Okay. All right. Where was I? Things blowing up. Yes. Okay. Yes. Scramble! German U-boats have been detected. Oh no! So we got some aircraft that are going to detect it, and of course then they use, how does an aircraft communicate with like boats that there's like a German submarine that's been sighted? Thank you very much. Radio. Very good. You got this radio communication going on, and the Germans are like, oh my, did the Germans communicate with each other as well? Yeah, through radio, but it's like you don't want to necessarily be talking because you can, even if you don't necessarily understand it before you crack the Enigma code, you can detect that there is German radio chatter and it's like, well, there's German submarines in here. So once you get the echolocation and so forth, question. Let's see if we can figure this out. How do you hit a German sub if it's under the water? Beautiful. Write it down. Depth charge. Do you know how a depth charge works? Yeah, it shoots off the destroyer. So if they detect a sub, a U-boat in the water in some certain area and so forth, I mean, it's like, what do you do if you're the sub? You're like, oh, crap. I mean, here's basically what the sub does. They try to stay really still and really quiet so that no one can hear anything. But, I mean, there's still the shape of the boat that is going to be detected by the sonar. And then the destroyers go up and back and forth, and they drop these depth charges. And they're like these big barrel things. They drop them off. And so they're moving, and they drop one, and they go so far deep to align with where they believe the sub was. And then it has a triggering device, and it blows up. So, yeah, if you're in there, you see these guys operating, you see like these destroyers going back. Drop, plunk, boom, boom, boom. If you're a German U-boat commander, you're like, are these guys ever going to leave? Raise your hand if you can tell me. What's one way that you might be able to fool the destroyers into thinking that they hit you? Blow up your own ship? Yeah, well, then they did hit you. You can't blow them up. The German U-boats, in order to be effective against the destroyers, they have to surface and fire a torpedo. As soon as they surface, everyone's like, well, we know exactly where they are. You don't have to use depth charges to hit a U-boat once they've surfaced. What can you use? You can use the guns on your boat to like bing, bing, bing. You've got all kinds of like artillery weapons and so forth. You just keep hitting them. Who's next? Okay, very good. So you get bing, 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 bing. So, still haven't got an idea. Come on, think about it. Commanders, U-boat commanders. Commandant, help us out. Down is good. How can you go all the way to the bottom of the ocean? Is there a problem with that? Pressure. You got to be careful. You can't go down too far deep because it'll crumple up like a can. So how do you fool? Hint. How do you fool the Allies into thinking that they've hit? Trevor, you're the commander. You're a U-boat commander. U-95. How do you fool these guys? What can, hint. What can you release into the water that makes it look like your ship, your U-boat has been sunk? Parts, trash, oil, bits and pieces. If you release it up, then maybe the destroyer captains are going to go, we hit our target, let's keep moving on because we got some deliveries to make. Does that make sense? Sometimes it works. Yeah, April Fools. Yeah, there was this one great German movie called Das Boot about the experience of a German U-boat commander. I mean, it's like intense. I mean, you start feeling for these guys anyway. They're part of the German Navy. The real jerk on the ship is the Nazi political officer, but, whatever. Make sure you write this down. The German U-boat is not going to be nearly as much of a threat in World War II. Got that? So when the Americans are trying to ship a lot of stuff over to prepare for the D-Day invasion, most all of that stuff is going to end up getting delivered. It's not much of it is going to get sunk by the German U-boats. Okay? Critical, speaking of technology, we got the Enigma, we got the early codebreaker machines and so forth. Aircraft carriers. This is the USS Saratoga. It was originally a carrier, and it was refitted to put a deck on the top to land, have aircraft land and take off. Later, aircraft carriers would be designed specifically for that purpose. They're going to be, I think you've probably already got hopefully a sense of this, they're going to be a critical component for the United States Navy as well as the Japanese Navy. And in fact, even today, our naval groups are organized around aircraft carriers. Okay? Because on the decks of these things, you have planes, and they're not all right there at the time. This one, they're all out there. You have to be careful if you have them all out there. They have ways of like little elevators of bringing them up and down, and they can fold back the wings and so forth to create more space. There's tons of fuel on there, obviously, because you need to fuel up the aircraft. Can you have big, big bombers, like strategic bombers on there? Why not? Too large. You need more runway to take off. Write this down. There was a commander in the United States military called Doolittle.
Oh, I saw that in the movie Big Way.
Yeah, it's in, yeah. Doolittle, after we got hit on 9/11, excuse me, December 7th, 1941, we were mad, and we're like, we're going to hit them. And we had a special mission. It was a one-way mission. We took one of our aircraft carriers and got it as close to Japan as possible. We got some bombers, mid-range bombers, and we lightened them up as much as possible so that we could put as much fuel on them as possible, as well as some bombs, and we flew them over Tokyo. It was a one-way mission. In fact, they took off a little bit sooner than they would have liked to because they had been spotted by like some Japanese fishing vessels, and they're like, oh, we better launch now because otherwise, this isn't going to work. They dropped bombs on Tokyo. They didn't have enough fuel to go back to land on the aircraft carrier. In fact, frankly, you need a little bit more space to land on an aircraft carrier than you need to take off. In fact, anybody know, on an aircraft carrier, what device is used to help slow down the plane as they land? Yes? Cables, yeah, they have these cables on the decks that run across, and you have what is called a tail hook on your aircraft. So it lands, you better have your seatbelt buckled. It lands, and you're slowing down, and then you hit the cable, and it's like, whoa! Because the cable has attached itself, or the tail hook has attached itself to the cable, and that slows you down. But Doolittle's flight did not come back. Their goal was to hit Japan, and then fly over, hopefully, nationalist or communist-occupied Chinese territory, and then bail out, and then you'd be, safe. Yeah. Some of them did. Some of them didn't. Some of the American crew was captured. But it was interesting. Write this down. Japan, they got an early insight. It was the first time that it happened. It's going to be an insight as to what's going to happen later on in the war. Civilian populations get bombed. And it happened early in 1942, and it's going to happen consecutively throughout 1945. So aircraft carriers. Japanese came up with very good technology here. Write this down. A Japanese torpedo bomber. We didn't quite anticipate this. I hinted at this even when we talked about the Russo-Japanese War. Remember how the Japanese sunk a lot of Russian ships by little dinky torpedo boats? If you get them close enough, you fire off a torpedo, that is a big explosion that could sink a ship. Well, if you got U.S. ships and battleships and so forth in the safe confines of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese aren't going to be able to get their subs in to sink them. But they had aircraft equipped with torpedoes. They flew in low enough, dropped the torpedoes, boom! We had a lot of U.S. naval ships that were blown up by torpedoes, as well as by conventional bombs being dropped by other Japanese aircraft. The battleship Arizona, you can still visit it in Pearl Harbor. There's still oil coming out of the ruins of the ship that had sunk where it was moored. And a lot of the sailors died, and a lot of them died, having drowned after the ship went under and they couldn't get out of the boat. There was no way. I think that one actually didn't get hit so much by a torpedo as by a bomb that had dropped, and it was a very well-placed bomb because it hit right where the ordnance was being kept. You know what ordnance is? Exactly. Ammunition. Your shells and other kinds of bombs and things that blow up. When my dad was on the aircraft carrier, his responsibilities had to do with ordnance. Yeah. There's the kamikaze near the end of the war. The Japanese aircraft, they're like, what can we do with these? Because we had already taken out a lot of their key aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway. And so they load up whatever planes they have left, chock full of explosives, and get as close to, what is their number one target? What's the number one target if they're going to be trying to hit the United States Navy? Battleship? Torpedo boat? Aircraft carrier? That's the one, yeah. Aircraft carrier. Yeah, and if you're on the aircraft carrier, you're like, what do we do? You've got guns along the deck and so forth. You're like, just trying to hit that sucker before he gets close enough to your ship, because if it does hit,